All right, we're going to start talking about the founding and the Constitution, and so here are the objectives for today. We're going to talk about what influenced the Founding Fathers and what acts by Congress lit the fuse, and why did the Articles of Confederation fail? Specifically, why is Shays' Rebellion important? And what different proposals were presented at the Constitutional Convention, and what compromises were made in order to ratify the Constitution. And we'll differentiate between the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists, and then finally talk about what was the final result. All right, if we think about what influenced the Founding Fathers, we have to think about who are the people involved. So the people who led the American Revolution and created the Constitution were making a fresh start. They had to start somewhere. These are the heirs to a philosophical and historical tradition as old as Western civilization itself. And it should be noted that the Founding Fathers were highly educated. Okay. And here we have Adams and Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson once said, "I cannot live without books." His library had over 6,500 volumes. And you can enjoy them today as they form the core of the Library of Congress. John Adams, there on the left, read 43 books in his 81st year. Now, these Founding Fathers were familiar with history and philosophy and literature of the ancient world, as well as what was considered modern literature at that time. They studied law and English history, both of which are found in our Constitution today. We also know that these individuals were very experienced. They came from the school of hard knocks. In creating the new nation, they drew upon their own experience. Many of those who were creating the Constitution and the Declaration had fought in the Revolution and had served in colonial government before America won its independence. And of course, we know that religion played an important role in terms of influencing our Founding Fathers. It's an important part of the educational background. They knew the Bible, they knew the Bible's teachings. So all these three elements highly influenced the Founding Fathers. And out of all these experiences, they wrote the Declaration of Independence, particularly Thomas Jefferson, where he states, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, and that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights governments were instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed, that whenever any form of the government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it and institute new government." Well, where did these ideas come from? This excerpt includes some of the most important philosophical ideals underlying our form of government. But these are not new ideas. They were the ideas that were familiar to almost everyone in the American colonies long before the Revolution. They'd been preached in churches. These ideas were written in pamphlets and debated both in private and public. And one main contributor was John Locke, an Englishman, and he's undoubtedly one of the most important influences on the thinking of the Founding Fathers. So Locke's political philosophy is also known as the natural rights philosophy, and he's one of the social contract theorists. And so I just want to say a few things in general about what social contract theory argues. And so the basic argument is that a state of nature exists, where individuals have natural rights. We all have natural rights that are God-given. Everyone is free in this state of nature that exists, let's say, without government. But everyone is also highly insecure. And this insecurity is uncomfortable, particularly to those who are weak in society. And so in order to overcome this weakness and fear, they form a society with a social contract, and this contract means that they're going to give up their natural freedoms for security provided by society. So individuals enter into society equally, that is, that they're equal in terms of legal aspects. And so once they form this society, they create these collective institutions of government. And people who were once free in a natural state accept some new restricted rights and duties in exchange for protection of rights and property. And the ruler at that particular moment assumes responsibility for this protection. And failure of the leader essentially breaks the contract, and members are then responsible to make changes to the contract and start anew. So there's two important notions here. One is the concept of popular sovereignty. Remember, we talked about that, meaning that people have the right to rule. And secondly, by extension, citizens can replace government when they're not fulfilling the social contract. Well, a lot of these initial thoughts about the social contract and the idea of law and nature comes from Hobbes, who wrote between 1588 and 1679. And according to Hobbes, power came from the people, not from God, which most people in society at that time believed. And so, in this state of nature, according to Hobbes, life is solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and it's short. So of course, man's overwhelming desire is to avoid that kind of violent death associated with a lonely, poor, nasty, and short lifespan. So he argues, Hobbes does, that there's a right to self-preservation, that this is a natural right. And man uses reason to leave the state of nature, which is natural, and enter into the social contract. Hobbes favors an authoritarian system, and that's why he has a need for what he calls the Leviathan. And the Leviathan is simply a metaphor for a strong, powerful government in order to preserve life, liberty, freedoms. And it's a system based on fear, that you're fearful of living life alone in a state of nature, and then you're fearful because you have a powerful state. Well, Locke comes along, and I'm not really sure he would qualify as a handsome man, but Locke comes along and builds upon Hobbesian ideas, but softens the concepts a little bit. And he says that men don't really fear death that much, just hunger and wants and probably other men. And that men are equal because all men have equal right to this self-preservation that Hobbes talked about. And men are free from other men, but they're not free from God's will. Remember, Hobbes is writing in the 1600s, early 1700s. And God's will is to preserve mankind. And so there is rule with reason, and that reasoning is to attempt to find God's will. And governmental power in a state of nature, therefore, is to carry out God's will, which, according to Locke, is to preserve mankind. So the creation of property ensures mankind's preservation. So Locke argues that property begins with one's own person in the form of freedom, in the form of rights, and in the form of labor. And so the value of your property, especially your labor, is what others place on it. So property ensures comfortable self-preservation, according to Locke. And government is not supposed to interfere with property rights. So Locke's definition of the social contract is that citizens agree to obey the laws and rules of the government in exchange for protection of their lives, liberty, and property. Of course, we know that phrase, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, which is found in our Declaration and our Constitution. All right, well, let's talk about some additional influences on the Founding Father in terms of their English heritage as we move toward the Constitution. All right. The rights of Englishmen had been established slowly over centuries in British history. There are certain basic rights that all subjects of the English monarch were believed to have, and they were fundamental in the sense that they could not be changed or violated. So the Founding Fathers drew upon these rights that they had as Englishmen. And the founders began their lives as loyal subjects of the British, and so were very familiar with the privileges associated with the rights of being Englishmen. And some of these rights that were inherent in being an English subject is that you had the right to a trial by jury, which we find in our Bill of Rights. You had the right to feel secure in your own home and protected from unlawful entry, which we have again in our Bill of Rights. And there was a tradition of no taxation without consent. And these historical sources, including the rights of Englishmen, were rights that were customary, and they were part of the law, and they were confirmed by the royal charters and had become part of English common law. But there were some additional documents that the Founding Fathers looked toward for guidance. And one of those is the Magna Carta in 1215. This is one of the first great landmarks of British constitutionalism, and it's one of the great charters of human liberty. Okay. Without going into the historical background of how the Magna Carta came about, what's important for us is the idea that this document set out and codified, that is, had written down some things that the government would be responsible for. And so in very general terms, it stated that the government should be based on the rule of law. And so it expressed the idea of limited government, which we are familiar with here in the United States. And this limited government would require the king to govern according to the established rules of law. So the king could no longer just act randomly in applying laws to the kingdom. The Magna Carta also laid out that there's going to be certain basic rights that aren't going to be denied by government. So in limiting the power of the king, the document expressed the idea that established rights of the governed could not be violated. So this offered a lot of protection and is essentially one example of that social contract between the ruler and the people that he ruled. All right, a second document is the Petition of Right, which came about in 1628. And this came about because the current king, King Charles I, tried to raise funds without the consent of Parliament. He also tried to quarter his soldiers in people's homes without their consent. So in 1628, the Parliament forced Charles to consent to this document called the Petition of Right, which confirmed that taxes could only be raised with the consent of Parliament, and it also guaranteed English subjects other rights, including the prohibition against requiring people to quarter soldiers in their homes. And so this should sound familiar. This is one of the complaints that the colonists had about the British Army. And so they knew about this law because of their history as English subjects. And lastly, there's an English Bill of Rights, and this resulted from what is called the Glorious Revolution of 1688. And it was a bloodless revolution resulting in the overthrow of King James II. Prince William of Orange, depicted there, and his wife Mary, agreed to a Declaration of Rights as part of the deal that brought them to the throne. And this declaration was enacted by law and became known as the English Bill of Rights. And here are some of the highlights that were provided by this English Bill of Rights. It provides a trial by jury. It prohibits cruel and unusual punishment, which again we now find in our Bill of Rights. It gives individuals the right to petition the government, which we have as part of our First Amendment, and the right to bear arms for personal defense. It should be noted that there are several things that this particular Bill of Rights does not provide, and it doesn't provide for freedom of religion. And of course we know this is one of the reasons why many people left Europe and came to the New World, because they were persecuted based on their religion. It doesn't provide for freedom of the press, and it doesn't provide for freedom of speech outside of Parliament. People who were members of Parliament could express their views openly as long as they were in Parliament, but outside of Parliament, speech was still restricted. So the Founding Fathers were greatly influenced by their education, their classical philosophers that they had read, like Locke and Hobbes, and the experience as British subjects. All right. We talked last time, as we again moved toward the kind of government that the United States was going to develop, talking about this idea of liberalism on one hand, where the important focus is on individual rights, that individuals are going to take responsibility of their own lives, and when you give up your responsibility to others, the concept was that you become less free. And so liberalism is the idea that society is going to be tolerant of others, there's going to be a strong work ethic, there's going to be economic self-interest, there's going to be political self-interest, and you were free to practice whatever faith you wanted. You were free to express yourself politically, and you were free to pursue any economic endeavors. So it's predicated and revolves around individual rights. Well, at the same time, we're forming a democracy. In a democracy, the important focus is on majority rule. So again, we have this paradox that I talked to you about at the end of last lecture, where there's a conflict between this majority rule and individual rights. That is a conflict between democracy and liberalism. So the founders, in order to solve this dilemma, understood that by making the country large enough, increasing diversity, and diluting the majority, what we would end up having is what we call liberal democracy. The resulting government is mostly liberal, it's democratic, but liberty in the United States context would become more important than equality. All right, so that's kind of the framework. And as we look at the founding fathers' move toward the Declaration of Independence, we have to think about who are the different interests and groups that make up the United States during this particular time period. We talked last time about the different ethnic groups that make up who are Americans today. It's not very different back in the colonial period. There are different groups based on these economic differences that have different financial interests. And so think of these as 5 different groups that make up what we could talk about as interest groups today. Each one of these groups have a different interest, and each one of these groups have different concerns and needs when it comes to the government. So you had New England merchants. You had Southern planters who relied upon trade, even with the New World, the Old World in Europe. You had the Royalists. These are individuals who are loyal to the British Crown. Then you had this new class of citizens, maybe what we could think of as an emerging middle class. These were the shopkeepers, the artisans, and the laborers who tended to live in the cities. And then you had small farmers all throughout the colonies. And so we have these 5 different groups who have different interests and different concerns when it comes to the relationship with the colonial government. Well, the British helped radicalize these colonists and had different groups emerging and perhaps cooperating with one another that never really thought about cooperating together before. And so they had some policies that they enacted in the years before the Revolution that brought about the colonists' fear that they were going to be discriminated against in trade with other countries. And so this is a depiction of the Boston Tea Party, which will become an important element in fomenting the colonists against the British rule. All right, so let's look at some of these decisions that were made. The Sugar Act of 1764. This enforced a tax on molasses. It's called the Sugar Act. The Stamp Act required printed materials to have a stamp on them. So all of these enacted new taxes on the colonists. The point of this is that before these taxes, the most powerful elements of society, and that's my phone, so let's hold on for 1 second. All right, sorry about that. Every now and then the phone's going to ring. So, as I was saying, there were some tax revolts or the colonists were revolting against the taxes because they were never enforced before. And so what we have is a situation where some of the most powerful elements in society, the merchants that I talked about before, the Southern planters, they were originally content with British colonial rule until these taxes were handed down. And it caused these different groups to coalesce with one another, and they started working with the lower classes in rebellion against the colonial government. The rebellion was an agreement not to purchase the stamps and increased rum running and boycotting of purchased taxed molasses. So here we see the early revolts that would soon lead to the American Revolution. Then, of course, we have the Boston Tea Party, which was a revolt against the monopoly by the East India Trade Company, which is a British company. And the goal was to provoke a clampdown by government, which would cause the Port of Boston and shut down the Massachusetts government. So we're getting ever closer to the Revolution. So this brings about the Declaration of Independence. And so the Declaration of Independence was the final straw where we have the colonists declaring that they are going to secede, if you will, from the British government. And then they had to figure out what kind of government are we going to form. All right. Well, this is probably a good time to take a break. I'm going to break up this particular lecture into Part 1A and Part 1B. And so I'll meet you back at Part 2.